Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, Launch of Chinese Handcuffs, How China Hijacked the Environmental Agenda. Please welcome Victoria Coates, Vice President of the Heritage Foundation's Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone to a very exciting day for those of us in the Davis Institute, the inaugural launch of our project called Chinese Handcuffs. And in case you didn't pick one up on your way in, we have these for everybody on the way out, which has become the emblem of this project, the game, the so-called child's game, in which you voluntarily immobilize yourself. And this is the one product that actually was made in China that I looked for one that was made in China. Because I think, it is critical for us to start to recognize what we are doing to ourselves vis-a-vis U.S. energy security and abdicating our energy security voluntarily to China in the name of climate. And they are doing this in a highly predatory, deliberate campaign to overtake us in energy and make us dependent on them. The good news is that we can right the ship and reverse this if we take it seriously. And so today, the first panel, which discusses the Chinese campaign, we are very pleased to publish. There are many, many people at Heritage I'd like to thank, starting with our Asian Studies Center in Davis, Andrew Harding and Aaron Walsh, who took lead on this project. And brought it to fruition in a very timely manner. We, of course, very grateful for our friends in the Climate and Energy group led by Diana Fergat-Roth. And that is one of our great strengths at Heritage, is our ability to work across disciplines and bring folks together to collaborate on a project such as this. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists who will be discussing this project here. We will then have time for Q&A here in the room, and then also for our friends joining us online. So if you'd like to join me. Aaron Walsh is a senior research fellow in international affairs at the Asia Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. She has had an extensive career in the private and public sectors, has worked for 4 Republican administrations, including President Trump's, when she was both at the Department of Commerce and a fellow colleague on the National Security Council staff. And critically for our project today, Erin also spent 12 years at Goldman Sachs and Cisco, and particularly at Goldman. She served in China, so she knows of what she speaks. Landon Darrence is a senior director and Morningstar chair for global energy security at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. And Landon was also a colleague of mine, both on the NSC and at the Department of Energy, where he has worked for several decades on energy issues. And then finally, last but certainly not least, Jack Spencer is a senior research fellow for energy and environmental policy here at Heritage in the Center for Energy, Climate, and the Environment. And he previously was our vice president of the Institute of Economic Freedom and Opportunity, which is, again, a very important perspective that Jack brings to our project here. He will also be deeply involved in Pillar 4 in his other area of expertise, which is civil nuclear energy. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage. In the honored tradition of ladies first, Erin, I would just like to start you with a total softball, which is, we've had the publication of how China exploits America's climate agenda today. Congratulations on that. What are your key takeaways from your research on this paper?
Well, thanks so much, Victoria, and also to Andrew Harding, who co-wrote the paper with me. The key takeaways are really, as you mentioned, that we right now are in the handcuffs of China, and this has been a multi-decade agenda that they have led, while at the same time our own liberal left agenda has brought us to this point. So that's quite disconcerting. The other issue is that the United States is the #3 energy producer in the world, and China is the #1 energy importer in the world. And what they're trying to do is to reverse this trend so that they become dominant in this new energy and renewables sector, and we become dependent on them. So that is an extraordinary place for the United States to be right now, and hopefully we'll be able to get ourselves out of it.
Great, thank you. And Jack, I can actually remember the moment when this project sort of cropped up in my mind. It was actually very early February of 2020. And as I was transitioning from the NSC to the Department of Energy, I read a report on this, which I found shocking in the degree to which China is doing this deliberately to create this shift in energy balance. And in your decades of observing energy policy, what's the trajectory you've seen for China? As Aaron says, the world's most needy consuming nation, but how have they sort of changed their role on the stage of global energy policy?
Well, first, thank you, Victoria, for inviting me here today to participate in this important event and with the whole project. It's interesting what China has done. For all intents and purposes, the United States should be dominating the world in energy, both on hydrocarbons, technology, across the board, because we have it all. We have lots of, we don't only have the natural resources, but we have the industry, we have the technology to dominate the world. But that wasn't good enough. The left has decided that what has lifted literally billions of people out of poverty over the last couple of hundred years, which is the introduction of hydrocarbons combined with free markets, wasn't quite enough. That they thought that they could manage this better. And they have used global warming as the vehicle to do exactly that. Now, why that's interesting and apropos to our conversation today is that it falls right into China's hands. Because what they have been able to do, because they are Chinese communists, is spend a whole lot of Chinese communist money to build their manufacturing facilities for things like wind and solar and electric vehicles, which are precisely what the environmental left is forcing us to buy. And over time, the trajectory has been us becoming more dependent on them. It's literally, you're using the Chinese handcuffs, but it's hand in glove, where we are building a policy for no good economic reason that completely opens us up to Chinese dependence. And I'm sure we'll talk more about why that might be, but that's the trajectory, unfortunately, and it's completely unnecessary.
Well, thank you. And Landon, Jack raised climate issues, which are central to this discussion. And we've seen the Biden administration set some very interesting long-term climate goals, and they have defined climate issues in documents such as their national security strategy as an existential threat to the United States. And where the conflict I see there is, if you do that, then you have to rank China, even if you take it seriously, as a lesser threat. So I'm wondering how you assess the goals that they've set, and also the critical question of, can they be achieved without the participation of China?
Yeah, no, thank you, Victoria. Thank you to the Heritage Foundation. Aaron, Andrew, congratulations on a really nice report. I think it reads really well, and it's articulating a very important conversation. It's not surprising, as Jack pointed out, that China would want to have dominance over its resource base. Its deficit of indigenous resources make it want to gravitate towards a new model, and the United States doesn't have that challenge. So we have to be thinking through these challenges from our perspective of how do we maintain our primacy on energy going forward. The Biden administration definitely has set out some, I think, fairly ambitious climate benchmarks, right? We're talking about 80% renewable energy generation by 2030, carbon-free electricity by 2035, zero emissions vehicles in the 2030s. I don't know if it's exactly 2030, but these are all benchmarks that require us to be engaged or require the world to grapple with how we make new energies affordable, and the repercussions of what those supply chains actually have on us. And I think to your point about how engaged China is in this value chain is a really important point. Looking at their command of energy resources, China has effectively 80% of solar manufacturing, nearly just as much on lithium-ion batteries, 70% of rare earth extraction, 90% of processing. The point is, when it comes to these new technologies, China has set up a framework that is clearly advantageous for them. And so if this is a yes or no binary question, can we achieve those benchmarks that the Biden administration set out without China? Probably not. And to do so without them is going to have economic consequence and really run up the cost of what is a policy-induced energy transition.
Well, and sticking with you for a moment, since you raised the supply chains, one of the things that the COVID-19 experience, I think, revealed to everyone was the fragility of global supply chains. And Erin is also, because she's Superwoman, working on a bipartisan report on the origins of COVID, which will be rolling out later on this month. So hopefully we'll be able to welcome you back then. But that one of the things, as I said, COVID revealed was these fragile supply chains, particularly the ones that run through China. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how those supply chains can potentially undermine our energy security.
Well, look, conventional energy supply chains we're really familiar with, right? It's oil and increasingly LNG are fairly global, fungible commodities. We know how to move them. America does them well. I think when you start to add the context of clean energy resources, it gets a lot more complicated. And there's a tremendous additional inputs that we have to break down. I mean, a battery itself has some 17 to 20 individual inputs. So when you're creating a lithium-ion battery, it's no longer just a barrel of crude oil. It's a much more complex chain. And as we discussed, through a series of state-led policies, of subsidies, of investments by the Chinese Communist government, what we've seen is them actually kind of surround and, as I pointed out with some of the figures before, concentrate their control of those energy resources. Now, there's a vibrant conversation going on about how we break up that dominance, but they clearly see the value of taking what is a much more complex supply chain and garnering benefits from the extraction standpoint, the processing standpoint, and the manufacturing standpoint to an end user that may or may not be able to be a part of that value chain. And right now, that's what we're grappling through the policy-led conversation we're seeing here in Washington.
I'm sorry to go off. Can I say something about the supply chain issue?
You may.
You should.
What COVID taught us is about the fragility of supply chains, but it's something more important that I think. It's the risk that governments impose on supply chains. It wasn't COVID that made supply chains break down. It was the response of governments shutting down the economy that caused supply chains to break down. We saw that again with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and that government shutting down supplies of natural gas to Europe. So I only bring it up because we need to soberly assess the risk that governments pose to these supply chains. And when you're talking about communist China, when they control a completely vertically integrated supply chain of something that our government is forcing us to depend on, it makes the risk that much more, even more than what what we saw under COVID.
Well, and I think that's an excellent point, Jack, and it actually was a good segue to my next question for Erin, which is that, to my knowledge, the history of what China has done in terms of deliberately dominating supply chains in this space This history really hasn't been written before. And, to my mind, this is very analogous to the 5G playbook, that you're going to move into a space, exploit various weaknesses to dominate it, and as Jack said, flood it with a whole lot of communist Chinese money and subsidies and whatnot that allow them to manipulate the market. Can you walk us through that campaign a little bit, Erin, and what your research uncovered?
Sure. Really, the whole energy space is extremely complicated, actually, in many ways. And one of the things that we wanted to look at is what underpins where we are today, and that is the history. And without starting at Genesis, I'll move us up to the 50s, and that's when really the global warming science started in the 1950s in the United States. And Al Gore, who many of you are familiar with, he was a student at Harvard, and he latched on to a professor who was very interested in this, and he decided that this was going to be a critical thing for the United States, global warming. And so he really moved ahead, and when he got to Congress, he started really building up an entire, I would say, a group of fellow members that would support this agenda. And they moved quickly to really start the first almost advocacy and activist movement on global warming and green energy. And with that, when he became a senator, he led the first Senate delegation to the first Rio summit, which was one of those COPs. You hear about the UN summits, the COPs that we have each year. And he then came back to the United States as vice president. He really drove a lot of the negotiations for this and for the climate agenda. And then when he left, he started a movie and made a movie and got an Academy Award from that. And from that, he got a Nobel Peace Prize. So it really was to his benefit to really keep driving this agenda. At the same time, in China in the 1960s, Mao Zedong was leading the Cultural Revolution. So you look at where China was and where Al Gore was, who was really the real godfather of our climate movement. And with Mao, after the Cultural Revolution, about 16 years later, China really became involved in starting to really move this agenda in terms of creating their own agenda for the most part. And Hu Jintao was the president at the time who really saw the impact of what was happening in China in terms of their pollution because of their industrialization that had taken place since the opening up of China with Deng Xiaoping and Richard Nixon. And so what we've seen is really this mass amount of water pollution, air pollution, really killing agriculturally and really starting to create a lot of health concerns within China, and that was going to create a lot of discomfort and social unease among the population, and that became a real issue for the CCP. And so when Hu Jintao got involved, he decided to push this agenda and really create China's agenda for green energy. And then when Xi Jinping came in 2012, he's the one that really accelerated their move in terms of these new energy and renewables, understanding, of course, that China does not have the energy that they need and have to import so much oil. For 1.4 billion people, they've got a lot to be dealing with. And so, therefore, they knew they didn't have the oil resources that the United States does, and nor do they have natural gas. And so what they wanted to do is to create these renewables. The U.S. had solar, and they decided to take that. Wind, they took over. And then they have the new energy vehicles and the batteries. So I know you're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's really important to understand the history of where we're at, because it's Gore, John Kerry, who was instrumentally involved in all of this in negotiating the Paris Agreement, Obama, and now Biden, that have brought us to where we are today.
Well, and along those lines, Jack, I'm plotting actually a double question for you next. So I'm going to bring this to Landon for a second to talk a little bit about the COPs. You and I were at Dubai together this December, and I really started watching them starting in Edinburgh. I guess 21.
Edinburgh would be 26. So two back.
Okay.
But COVID gets in the way.
But the evolution of the COP, what it does, and is that conversation shifting noticeably? Did it shift in Sharm or in Dubai? And what do you anticipate coming next year in Baku?
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate it, Victoria. Look, the COPs have been the platform for global diplomacy. So this has been a government process around how we address global emissions, which...
what does COP stand for?
It's the Conference of Parties, but there are many COPs. So there's COPs for tobacco, there's COPs for climate. This is a climate COP, so we're talking about the climate COP. And I think the most famous of the climate COPs to date has been the Paris Agreement in, I want to say, 2015. I could be wrong on that, I'd have to think. But that is one of John Kerry's, going back to Aaron's points, signature achievements and his legacy on these issues. And it's been a government process. And what was different about Paris at that moment in time was governments around the world creating their own framework for benchmarking their commitment to reducing emissions based on 2005 benchmarks. What has shifted to your question in COP28 is you can only diplomatically talk about change so long. And so you can set benchmarks, you can have nationally determined contributions to the process, but eventually industry and others in the private sector have to get involved and lead to change. So what we're seeing now is this conversation about change. And one thing that Aaron pointed out is not every government, and Jack's pretty passionate about this, not every government is taking this just by markets alone, right? We're getting very involved and we're seeing this era of industrial policy. And so everybody's grappling with, at this point, what the energy transition means in the context of these COPs. And the conversation, for better or worse, is galvanizing at the end of the day at each one of these events annually. I wouldn't say that each COP has its own magnitude of impact. The next COP in Baku will be focused principally on finance. So, right now there's a global benchmark around $100 billion a year to the developing world to help them address climate. That's a pledge that principally the developed world has made, OECD countries, and they're looking to see that even bigger. Now, admittedly, that's been challenging to fit and match to begin with. So, I don't know the utility in moving that benchmark further if you can't consistently achieve what you've set out to do already. But regardless, that's how this COP's going to happen. I think from the Atlantic Council standpoint, we spend a lot less time thinking about the actual negotiated process and a lot more about how you have industry and others part of the story so that our companies, the United States government, and U.S. companies are engaged constructively to make sure that we have a real strong appreciation of where our energy system's moving and maintaining our primacy and centrality to that process.
Yeah, and along those lines, that again is a good segue into what I've been cooking up for Jack, which is, when we were preparing, and we did actually prepare for this event, that we have this conventional wisdom that the United States has to respond to China's predatory activities with some kind of coherent policy. And when you hear about China dumping components for solar panels into Vietnam, Vietnam assembling them, sending them to the U.S. as a Vietnamese product, the natural response is to say, this is terrible, and it is actually against our laws. This is all accurate. And then you have climate envoy Kerry coming out and yelling at the U.S. company that raised this issue because it was going to prevent the cheap Chinese solar panels from coming to the United States, and that was his priority in his position then. But as we've been discussing it, both in terms, and this is where I want to maybe give you the opportunity to address both the second and the third questions, but China's anti-competitive practices, what are some of the pitfalls we're going to fall into if we respond to this just through this conventional wisdom approach? Because I really want your views to inform, the recommendations we eventually make on this in Pillar 4, and it's not precisely what you might think.
Look, we should always strive for fair and free trade between like-minded countries. I'm not sure where China lies on that. But that's not what this issue is about. What the Biden administration has done is created a catch-22 for every American. They created a situation through their so-called green energy mandates that essentially forces the United States to buy from China. People will respond to that. We shouldn't be buying these things from China. So what's the alternative? That we fill our car factories in Detroit with subsidized EV manufacturing, that we replace good American coal and natural gas producing things with American-made wind and solar? And then what happens when those subsidies go away? You have a complete collapse of an even broader swath of the American economy because we've used subsidies and government policy to malinvest massively for these green energy things inside the United States. So we're left with this catch-22. Either you're dependent on China, or you dedicate massive swaths of your industrial capacity to this thing that is a political manifestation. Both are really bad outcomes for every American. And that's why we need to get off of this hamster wheel of the green energy farce. We need to, look, I would like to see actual free markets drive energy policy. But let's just at least get back to where we don't have this completely artificial energy economy that's creating all of this, that is creating very distorted investment decisions and will cause mass disruptions for the American economy. There's just no good outcome if we continue down this road. So that would be.
I think recognizing both sides of that is one of the critical points that this report makes, and which we will continue to hammer in the next three pillars. And Aaron, to what Jack was just talking about, which is how these policies touch everyday Americans. I can't think of an issue besides energy that touches each and every one of us, regardless of our socioeconomic class, regardless of where we live. We all need energy to live. And on top of that, we are looking at, and I'm trained as an art historian, I don't pretend to understand this, but the energy demands of artificial intelligence are going to be dramatic. As much of a quarter, again, what we're consuming right now over the next 5 years alone. And so, the fact of the matter is we can't do that on wind and solar. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on everyday American lives that you all looked into as you were preparing this report?
Sure. Well, a couple things is that really, as we saw in the history, this has been created, this whole agenda for the most part has been created by elites. And they're okay in this whole situation, but regular Americans are not for two reasons. The first is national security. China controls, as Landon mentioned, they control the rare earth supply chain. And rare earths are needed not only for different things around the world, but more importantly, they're needed for our defense needs. And so let's say we go to war. With the grace of God, we won't be, but let's say we do. Rare earths go into everything from drones to radios to F-35 fighters. And so for us not to have access to rare earth and production and the critical minerals, that puts us at a real disadvantage, ourselves and our allies. The second issue is Victoria's talking about is specifically everyday households for everyday Americans, and that is the cost of energy. Energy creates inflation, the cost of energy creates inflation, and everything that we see and do has an energy impact to it. Whether it's our agriculture, the food that we eat, the electricity and the electrical grid, every single aspect to the fuels in our car, of course, has an energy component. And the number one issue now is inflation. And that's what's going to lead, hopefully, voters to change their mind in November, simply because we cannot continue to tolerate this. The American people cannot have this level of cost on them every single day.
Now, Landon, One other aspect of this, with your history and perspective, I was hoping we could talk about is the United States is not alone in this vulnerability that we are creating for ourselves vis-a-vis China. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about particularly Europe, as we are now well on our way through year 3 of the Ukraine war. Europe's very real energy vulnerabilities have become starkly clear to the rest of the world, yet they continue to take actions that don't seem to recognize that reality, and things like continuing to buy Russian energy, things like shuttering nuclear power plants in Germany. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing in Europe and what, if any, hope we have for them to change course.
Yeah, we're on the cusp of elections in Europe, and I think I was in Brussels this past February, and in 2019, just given the global dynamics, the political dynamics, the heft of these issues around energy transition that weighed on the populace then, they elected a green wave. It moved left, if you will, in the Commission, and you've seen policies that really invigorate that as a baseline. It shouldn't be surprising, though, because like China, Europe is resource poor, so they don't have the energy resources that we have. Some countries like Norway obviously are the exception, but ultimately the United States is blessed with a pretty strong resource base and played a huge role in backfilling the gas supply that dropped off after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That said, I think they're weighing equally, and this is a moment of inflection. So I think it's important, as Jack says, that we do think about this hamster wheel and debate how we address policy next steps. Because before you can do that, you really have to have appreciation of how we got here. And I think it's important to reflect on the fact that we talk about the overwhelming control and dominance, frankly, China has created around some of these rare earth minerals, around critical inputs for the clean energy economy. But that started way before then. I mean, we moved back to the 1950s, 1960s. In the 1970s, China imposed regulations on joint ventures and investment in their country being with domestic origin companies. So OMEs, the auto manufacturers that wanted to go there had to build partnerships. Those partnerships had forced IP sharing. And if they're not taking IP indirectly, they definitely have forced companies to transition this. You couple that with a domestic market of 1.4 billion, build out markets of scale through oppressive policies that keep competition down. Even when you lift, and I'm talking in this context about the electric vehicle market, even when you lift the requirements about joint ventures come 2022, if you have a command and you own 70% plus of your domestic market, you're now able to project that outwards. There's no catching up. It's very difficult for international competitors, whether they're in Europe or America, to now compete with that market. And Europe, for one, has seen that impact their domestic market. If you're going through the EV policy and the imports of EVs, they're doubling year on year to hundreds of thousands of vehicles now coming into the European market. And the expense and the challenge here is, European automakers, for example, have vested very heavily in the Chinese market for ICE engines, but China's trying to sunset that. So you do get this catch-22, and we have to be really cognizant that these policies, this manipulation of a market process actually has real outcomes. And I think that's what we're deliberating over right now.
Well, and Jack, Landon mentioned the capacity of the United States to surge natural gas into Europe in the wake of the Ukraine war, which perhaps I'm biased because I worked in the Trump administration, but to my understanding, that was largely because of the more streamlined permitting process allowed those additional facilities to be constructed that came online, almost miraculously in 2022 to get that product across the Atlantic. At the Heritage Foundation, we're deeply committed to deregulation, to allow for the exercise of free markets and capitalism. Can you talk a little bit about what that program might look like if we had a change between administrations and had a more conservative approach?
Yeah. You know, the thing about energy markets, and we see it all the time, is that they're extraordinarily resilient, whether it's, if they're allowed to operate. You know, whether it's conflict in the Middle East or Europe or wherever, our hydrocarbon markets, gas, oil, and coal, are very resilient. And that's because you have had decades of investment in those industries, because that's what people want and use. What we've seen more recently is greater restrictions on those markets, to the point where, I mean, President Biden in the campaign said he's going to shut them all down. And the result of that is a loss of that resiliency, a inability to as effectively respond to challenges over time. I think what we will see under a conservative administration is a reversion back to allowing energy markets to work as they should. That doesn't mean we'll produce more or less energy. It means that we will produce the amount of energy we need to feed the economy. If it's more, then we will be able to export more, to produce more, to get those molecules where they need to go. We've seen things like the Biden administration with their decision to put a pause on additional natural gas exports. These are all things that chill that chill investment. We've seen this on, you know, it costs billions of dollars to build new, you know, new factories and things. And they just can't do it whenever the administration is saying, we're going to shut you down. And so I think we'll see a reversion of that. There's got to be reform on some of the environmental policy, like the National Environmental Policy Act, which just everyone acknowledges has become onerous. I think a big thing will be opening up development on federal lands. We've seen this administration take massive swaths of federal land out of commission for development, and for no good reason. I mean, they will portray it as a good reason. They will say we're protecting this thing or that thing, but the fact of the matter is none of this development, you know, the thing that comes to mind is there's a bunch of land around the Grand Canyon that they took offline for uranium development. And to read their press conferences, you would think that people would be mining in the Grand Canyon. No one's mining in the Grand Canyon. It would be far away from the Grand Canyon, but it's still part of that federal estate. And I think that really across the board, opening up federal lands for energy development, allowing, giving the private sector the confidence that it can make these investments without the government trying to shut you down will be game-changing going forward.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I think we can move on now to our audience questions and answers. I will give you guys opportunity at the conclusion to make any points that I missed. But if we have mics here in the room, if you could stand up, state your name and affiliation, and to whom you're addressing your question, or you can just say for the whole panel.
Hi, my name is Kevin Mooney. I work here at the Daily Signal at the Heritage Foundation. I'll ask this in a little bit of a cheeky way. Is there anything Biden and his minions are doing that a paid foreign agent of China would do differently? If the answer is no, should the president register as a foreign agent?
Aaron, do you want to?
Sure. No, you're exactly right. It's exactly what China would be doing right now, and we're seeing it. Should he? That's not my call, but yeah.
We've got. Maybe you two can pass the mic back and forth.
Sure. Hello, my name is Eric Meltzer. I'm with Meltzer and Associates. The question I have is, what are your thoughts on Elon Musk's visit to China last week with Premier Li Qiang? It seems to be a bit of a paradox that Musk is advocating for freedom of speech, but does a lot of business with the CCP. And how much could his business dealings with Tesla in China benefit the CCP and harm U.S. interests, talking about batteries?
And overtly, when you think about Elon Musk's business model, right, and Tesla, and China's dominance over the battery value chain and the growth of peer competitors like BYD and CATL, they have to. I don't know a situation in which this is exactly where the conversation starts today. China has incubated a policy process that makes people have to gravitate to them as opposed to how we've done business successfully for the past century. And we have to grapple with not necessarily Elon Musk, but how the United States, its partners and allies, respond to that effectively, because obviously a situation where there's a century of Chinese control over our energy resources, I don't think is anything that a policymaker in Washington, D.C., and certainly I would not be an advocate for.
I totally agree with that. I would say, I'm not going to comment on the player, but I'll comment on the game. And this is the game that this administration has created. It's this ecosystem that it's created that makes it such that Elon Musk or whomever, has much to benefit by going and engaging these guys. So, one can criticize Elon, I guess. That's not where I'm at. I'm more concerned about the public policies that create the system that make it advantageous for him and others to do that.
Right.
Hi, my name is Trevor Kolodny, and I work with the Department of Homeland Security. I guess my big question would be, to what extent can America grapple this challenge alone, and to what extent do we need to have, European allies or other allies and, parties on board? Just because, when I think of so many of these issues, if the rest of the world is going towards green energy anyways, China will still be, enhancing its own position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And, you look at things like the European Union's thinking about putting a carbon tax on imports. And so much of the areas that you can explore for energy would come outside of the United States. So I guess I'm just sort of asking about, to what extent can America do this alone, and what can be done if necessary to sort of bring other allies who might be more invested in, the climate agenda aboard? Thank you.
I think the United States should show some real climate leadership here by rejecting the whole idea from a policy standpoint. I think that there are lots of countries who would love for the United States to stand up and not reject climate science, but reject the way climate science has been portrayed as there being a consensus around it, saying, look, we need to look more at this. And the actual state of climate science is not such that we should reorient the entire economy around that. And while we continue to look into that, we're going to continue to move forward with what has literally lifted millions of people out of poverty over the last 200 years, which is allowing markets to drive energy policy forward for the most part. And I think that we would have lots of countries come in behind us. And I would say one further thing, this notion that because the rest of the world is doing something, therefore the United States should do it. If the thing they are doing is corrupt and immoral, then we shouldn't do it. And if it's based on bad economics, we shouldn't do it, because it will collapse. It will collapse. So we can take advantage of, if people want to keep doing that, knock yourself out. We need to show real climate leadership, which is doing something different than everyone else seems to be doing right now.
Jack and I have had pretty impassioned conversations around this issue, and I think
it's worth listening to.
No, I think the point of this report and this process that Heritage Foundation is going through is identify, is there a successful path forward with that kind of policy? What you're portraying in this question, I think, is where I see the general conversation today, which is whether we agree on the timeline of the trajectory, whether and how politics vacillate, how we get there. There does seem to be a sense of inevitability in the air right now. I think this report's challenging whether or not that can change. In the interim, it's important to think about what we're prioritizing, though, too. Is this about climate? Is this about emissions? Is this about competitiveness? Is this about economies? I really ultimately think this is about security and the future of the free world and democracies. And I think the fact that we've allowed the CCP to gain this level of control over an energy system is a concern, and we should be concerned. And I would tell you, I think that I would find, if I was to travel internationally, certainly within the G7, actually much more continuity in that position than some may think. I don't know that we have the solutions, but we're exercising that effort right now, and I applaud the Heritage Foundation for at least pushing that envelope, because we have to have this debate.
Aaron, did you have an intervention?
We will see in time, like we did with the 5G, we will see the Europeans, they're starting to get upset about their own electric vehicles and their own markets, and we're going to see more and more. If the United States leads, we do need allies. We do need more than just ourselves in this fight. And we'll see the Gulf too. While the Gulf hosted the last COP that you were both at, and they said the first time we're going to start really unraveling fossil fuels. Well, they've got years and years of fossil fuel capability left. I don't think they're going to give that up tomorrow. So I do think we're going to have our allies with us.
Well, and that really is the point, of this report, because one, quite frankly, of our biggest challenges in the Trump administration was the realization of what was happening with 5G, our lack of tools to combat it, and having to have a knockdown, drag-out brawl with the United Kingdom over 5G, which, it's painful when you have an ally that close, both in, economic security, pretty much every English-speaking, any sector you care to mention, that was that close. That this really can be a huge problem for us, so.
Jennifer Deloe with Bloomberg News. We've talked a lot about the problem here, and I was hoping we could just drill down a little bit more on the potential solution. I gather Jack doesn't think it's subsidizing the industries domestically, and I appreciate the desire to change the conversation around climate, short of getting local and state governments and corporations in the U.S. to buy into that too. I wonder if there is a role for more tariffs, more protectionism, particularly to counter market manipulation that we're seeing in some of these industries. Clearly, the solar industry is pursuing that today. It's for the whole panel.
I would not be a huge fan of more tariffs, or as I call them, taxes on the American people for their decision to buy things abroad. If we're concerned about China, then we should do that, but not to protect some other domestic industry that is itself dependent on policy and subsidies. But I'm even more against it because we haven't done the million things we need to do domestically in order to be able to compete. Why don't we loosen up the environmental regulations that have been on an upward trajectory for years? Why don't we treat capital more sanely so that American businesses can be more competitive? Why don't we not, President Biden now wants to make America to lead the world in business taxes. That's not the way to rebuild an industry. There are a million things we can do to make America more competitive. Let's do those things. And if we still can't compete, then maybe talk about tariffs. Maybe they'll work this time. I don't know.
But in the absence of alternatives, I do think that there's a consistent pace in which climate border adjustment mechanisms and other tools of trade are becoming the in vogue way of addressing climate policy. So, if we can't articulate another path forward, and I think it probably needs to be legislated, not just through executive orders that waffle back and forth between administrations, you're going to see a fairly persistent pace of climate and emissions entering into the trade conversation, which is inevitably also a tariff conversation. And given the scale of complexity in these supply chains, look, it doesn't mean it can't be changed. It doesn't mean a Trump administration wouldn't change that policy, but right now that seems to be the trajectory we're headed on.
I think it depends upon where we are with our national security and the energy situation. If we have a conservative president come in, it's very highly likely that there would be tariffs put on. That's highly likely. And in my opinion, it's necessary because with the EVs coming in and flooding in over the border and the way that they're putting up the ability in Mexico and pushing them over. They're going to crush our own industries, and they're going to continue to tie our hands. And so the fastest way that you can go up against our number one adversary in the world is to put tariffs, high tariffs, on what they want to export the most and dump. So.
I hope that before we use tariffs to subsidize American EV manufacturing, we work to get rid of the EV mandates so that the demand that we're trying to protect is an organic and sustainable demand and not one that is itself dependent on policy. Because my fear is that if you're protecting an industry that is itself a function of bad policy through tariffs, you will end up with a very difficult economic matter to deal with at some future point.
I think we can all agree that ending the EV mandate is a policy we can get behind.
Mark Lerner, I've heard that mining for these rare earth minerals that you need for EV batteries is causing severe environmental damage in places like China. Is that true? And if so, why aren't we hearing more about that?
The environmental standards that China upholds are very different than ours. So almost anything that they do regarding development that has an environmental impact will probably be greater than what happens in the United States or a Western country. To me, however, that's a China problem. The US problem is that, or I should also say that China mines and engages in other economic activities that impact the environment in a negative way is a comment on China, not on the activity. So it's sometimes framed as, I don't know that you meant to frame it this way, but it is sometimes framed that it's the mining for critical minerals that is the problem. It is not. It is the China that is the problem. The China that's the problem, we'll call it that. We'll leave it like that. Instead, as I mentioned before, we can do mining in the United States in an environmentally friendly way that's not heavily regulated. That's what we should be doing. Not because China is deciding to pollute itself. If that's what it wants to do, they're grown people there, they can do what they want. But we shouldn't be hamstringing ourselves and not being able to mine at all because of a fear of environmental degradation. We can do it cleanly.
But just one point to add, and that is China is not only doing it in their own country, what they're doing is the developing world, and most importantly in Africa. And they're just tearing them to shreds and taking their own wealth out of those people's hands and using child labor, and their standards are diabolical. Well, you hear it, but not in the mainstream media. And so it's, yeah, it is inconvenient for the climate narrative.
It's inconvenient for a lot of us who use technology. I mean, it's not. I mean, we talk about it, but when I say all of us, I mean in the grandest sort of way.
And Andrew, do we have any online questions? We've got time for about one more and then move to closing remarks.
Sure. We have one online question that's looking into how we talked about the values of hydrocarbons and the value about that energy trajectory through a conservative perspective. There's also a question looking at how can we recapture and reshape the environmental agenda to a more reality-based agenda, say in the context of renewable energy. Does it play a role? How do the markets incorporate that? How can, from a conservative angle, can renewables be a factor moving forward?
Lan, did you want to take the first bite of that?
I didn't catch the full question. Go in the back end there again.
So we're looking at how can we recapture and reshape the environmental agenda to a more reality-based agenda?
I think this starts with where our baseline is. It's very easy to backcast climate standards and take a point of emissions where the climate movement wants to be. I think the complexity of getting to that benchmark isn't linear, though. This is why we're having conversations around the economics, principally around the security aspects of China. And so, you know, the technology, a lot of this technology is pioneered and innovated in America, whether through the US government or through private industry. We've done both. And it's been refined. And so I don't have an issue with the technology. I think what we're having an issue with, and the challenge is that one economy through unfair business practices, inexpensive, cheap labor, and frankly, dirtier energy, right? 60% of China's grid is on coal, is capitalizing and monopolizing this segment of the market, of which there's a push to make that the primary and principal side of the energy sector of the future. So I think for me, the technology is not the challenge. It really is the China, to take Jack's words, the China problem here that is weighing on how we think about renewable energy. I think we can be advocates for clean energy and should be, to the degree that they're happening in a market that allows the United States, its partners and allies to excel as well.
I agree with that. I mean, look, if people present it as there's this balance that we have to strike between energy and the environment. That's not true. The more developed society becomes, the more energy they use. And you know what else happens? The cleaner the environment becomes. We've seen it time and again, country after country, in our own country, actual pollutants, the particulate matter, ozone, all of these things, the criteria pollutants that the EPA regulates, have all gone down dramatically over the last couple of decades, all while having immense economic growth. So this idea that we can't have economic growth and protect the environment just isn't true. Look at the poorest countries around the world. It's not like they're sitting around in the environmental paradise. They are in degraded economies. So what from a conservative standpoint, what we should be seeking is economic development, and then understanding the role that energy plays in that. And what hydrocarbons have been the key to that over the last couple hundred years. So the question is, moving forward, I would argue the best way, if one cares about renewables or one wants to move away from hydrocarbons, it shouldn't be driven by government. What that will do is virtually assure that whatever the government picks will exist in mediocrity forever. What we should do is allow the market to drive technology forward, just like coal took the place of whale oil. Something will, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. There's all the incentive in the world for someone to figure out a way to produce energy cheaper. That's all, and the market is the best way to do that. Allow capital to flow towards the best ideas. That's how you overcome hydrocarbons, if that's what you want to do. The government should set a predictable regulatory environment that's not too heavy, and allow people and businesses to do their thing.
Well, and being mindful of C-SPAN, which is taping, so we have to conclude sharply at 3. Aaron, you've got about 45 seconds to make any point that you would like to make that we missed.
Sure. I don't think we missed anything. I think we covered it and could go on for days. But I just want to say that China is not a partner of ours in the whole environment issue and the energy environment. They're going to continue to do what they want to do for as long as they want. They are starting up 2 coal burning plants, dirty coal, per week, and have an amazing trajectory across their provinces to continue to do this. And they believe that they are still developing, and as long as they're still developing and becoming more and growing more, they're going to do what they want to do. So I think we need to be very realistic, as that questioner had asked, about what we're facing in terms of our own national security. Jack?
I would say that while we need to be very concerned about what China is doing and recognizing that we are playing exactly into their hands, we need to be more concerned with what we're doing. We are making the policy decisions. We are the ones who are making it easy for China to take advantage of us. And if we stay on this trajectory, we're going to find ourselves in a very difficult place economically and from a national security standpoint.
Let me foot stomp something we have talked about a little bit, but really need to hammer down, which is security. It's really where this conversation is going to drive from here. There's a reason Beijing is prioritizing national security, data privacy, cybersecurity. You think about the communication of the systems of the future, the increased digitalization also of some of these clean energy resources, and you're getting real-time data. including with LiDAR, including the layouts that could map a room like this. And so I think the next iteration of this conversation really is going to hone in on the security component. I think it's incredibly important that we do. And I think it'll be a catalyst for change, including in the conversations around supercomputing and other topics.
Excellent. Well, we can end right on time. Thank you, Landon, for teasing Pillar 2, which, if you can keep your eyes open for the announcement of its arrival in the next 6 to 8 weeks, will focus on the military dimension of this problem and all of the ramifications of that. So thank you to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this event. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to those of you who joined us online. Have a wonderful rest of your day.